Hey guys, what's happening? Dawood here, reporting live with a new chess video, and in today's video we will be analyzing a match between two chess titans, um, especially in the late 90s leading up until the early 2000s when they were both really active. It's a world championship clash between none other than Garry Kasparov, who's widely considered to be one of the best players of all time, and a former student of his, Vladimir Kramnik. And this match took place in the year 2000, and many thought that it would be a easy task for Garry to be victor or victorious once the match had run its course. And he was considered a heavy favorite. And Kramnik at the time would then be regarded as the underdog in this match. But during this time, in this match in 2000, Kramnik had come prepared in the sense that his defensive play was quite impenetrable. It was during this World Championship match that the lines in the Royal Lopez, such as the Berlin defense for that you play with black, was popularized by Kramnik, and Kasparov could not find a way through this rock solid defense that we come to know today as modern players. But in this game, Kramnik had the white pieces and Kasparov had the black, and I took the liberty in deciding to analyze this marvelous game that exhibits Kramnik's positional prowess and strength with either side. And Kramnik started with one d4, and Garry responds with knight to f6, c4, g6. So now we have a sort of King's Indian coming perhaps, or knight c3, standard line to follow, d5 by Garry, and this now invites the Grünfeld, and so we have Kramnik accepting with c takes on d5. So now in the exchange version or the exchange line of the Grünfeld, knight takes on d5. Standard lines now are e4. We have knight f3 is quite popular as well, and e4 is played. So this is one of the main lines. So e4, then you'd have the knights threatening. So knight takes c3 is quite possible for black. Bishop g7. Well, not right now. Otherwise, the pawn would just capture there. So black would most likely take knight c3, and b takes c3, and bishop g7 is the standard way to go about the exchange variation of the Grünfeld. Players such as Maxime Vachier-Lagrave in modern day chess love playing this opening with black, and you would normally find that c5 is played often with queen a5 lines, castles, and a sacrifice of the b7 pawn often occurs after white would play rook b1. Now this is heavy in theory, and seeing that this is a world championship match, it's quite likely to assume that both players came quite prepared. So let's see how it progresses. We have knight f3, just bringing the knight and adding more protection to the d4 pawn, comfortably developing. Ideas like bishop e2 also spring into life, or bishop d3, even c4 maybe the objective to castle. c5, as spoken of earlier. A common trap is that if one captures the c pawn, d takes c5, then we just have bishop takes c3, and that's immediately losing, because not only would the king be in check, but the rook's also hanging. So white would decline taking that pawn, rather plays bishop to e3, because if takes now, bishop captures as well is fine, and that would just allow for a trade, and the position's quite equal, slightly better for white, but nothing black can't defend with proper play. Alright, so thereafter queen a5, applying more pressure on the c3 pawn here. So standard line in this standard defense in this line would be queen d2, and Kramnik rightfully plays that. Bishop to g4, and rook b1, taking control of the half open b file, also applying pressure on the b7 pawn, and a6 is played. So Kasparov is now allowing the take on b7, but that comes with compensation for black, positional compensation. So Kramnik obliges, he captures on b7. Bishop takes on f3, now doubling white's pawns. But this is a common structure, common theme in the Grünfeld line, that white would allow the capturing of this knight. If anything, white's confident enough to say, I don't see any direct or ominous or threat on my king, so I will allow that, and perhaps in future, after developing my bishop, I will take the liberty to castle, as there is no direct threats on the king. So double pawns aren't necessarily a bad thing, depending on the position, of course, or weakening your pawn structure. Knight c6, attempting to develop the rook as well now is black, and bishop to c4, now eyeing the f7 pawn perhaps, and indirectly the rook also setting his sights on this pawn. And the rook on the sorry guys, stay hydrated. The rook on the 7th rank is very strong for white, and this is also a common theme that we are taught in starting our chess. If you can get your rook on the opposing side's ranks, on the 1st or 2nd rank, it's quite strong. So castles as well by Kramnik. Kasparov captures, and now we have a trade fest. We have c takes on d4, bishop takes, bishop to d5, applying pressure on the knight, bishop to c3. Now this bishop is quite enjoying this long diagonal that it can operate from. So a nice in-between move by Garry Kasparov, applying pressure on the queen here. So white can't capture this knight, as the queen would hang. So first we go queen to c1, knight to d4, considered an inaccuracy to an extent, but some engine analysis sees this as fine, though the chess base questions this move quite a bit. But as the game continued, there was no real actual threat, so just a capture, or the knight d4 move wasn't considered a blunder, perhaps an inaccuracy. Bishop takes, and now we have rook takes on e7. As we can now see in the position, it is 5 versus 4 pawns, but Kasparov is confident that because white has got this damaged pawn structure, that perhaps he can pull off a draw, because this position is better for white. Black has to defend precisely, and up to this point, black is doing a fine job in doing that. Comfortable space for the rooks to develop now, and yeah, although aesthetically it's more pleasing for white, the position. White's got more space with the bishop attacking, more open lines, but with precise play, black can hold off to a draw. So we have rook to a7 proposing now a trade of rooks, and white obliges this trade. So Kramnik captures, rook takes a7. Now we have bishop takes a7, and now the position is starting to simplify. f4, and Kramnik now believes that he can penetrate the king side and the defenses of black, perhaps thinking of moves such as f5 and perhaps a trade, and maybe even queen to g5, applying more pressure in future, and king maybe to h1, and then rook to g1, and just dominating this g file. Let's see what happens next. Queen to d8, perhaps in defense of that, perhaps getting the queen to f6 maybe, g7 ideas, or even h4. Yeah, queen to c3. And now it's becoming quite clear that white is aiming to really take advantage of this diagonal. The bishop can't really do anything because white's bishop is so powerfully placed in the center of the board. Per se, the bishop was on b3, then moves such as bishop to d4 for black would have been very much possible, and then bishop g7, just comfortably defending. But because this bishop is so strong, perfectly placed, we can see that white's really starting to take an initiative now. Already got some initiative on the a2, g8 diagonal, as we see here with this light squared bishop of white. And black's light squared bishop, although it has space, it's not doing that much. It's not applying any pressure. White's king's not in any danger. No pieces are really in trouble. Nothing is in trouble at all. And we can see with these pawns here that white's in the position of taking more initiative and able to commit more. Black would just have to defend for the next few moves. And this is perhaps the downside of the Grünfeld, because it requires a high level of accuracy and theoretical understanding. And obviously players at this level would possess that. But as Garry Kasparov once said himself, if you play 10 good attacking moves back to back to back, the opponent is bound to crack somewhere. So, did this happen? Let's find out. Bishop to b8, applying pressure on the f4 pawn over there. We have queen to f3 defending. Queen to h4, also attacking now the f4 pawn. So we have the queen and the bishop eyeing the f4 pawn. Kramnik goes e5, a nice defensive move, but also taking up space in the center with the pawn. Now disallowing this queen takes on f4 ideas, not possible anymore because queen takes and the bishop can't jump over the pawn. Chestnut checkers. Yeah. So g5, a committal move here by Garry, and Kramnik not taking, rather instead of g on f takes g5, he first makes space by rook e1 to defend, or not making space, he first defends the e5 pawn, because if takes, this pawn is weak, right? And then bishop takes on e5, and now black is even eyeing mate, and black would have time to consolidate the position, and it would be dead draw. So, queen to f4, and now Kramnik, in typical Kramnik style, exchanges queens. Queen takes f4, g takes f4. Kramnik was quite renowned for this in his younger days, wanting to trade off queens as soon as possible and simplify the position, because it's excellent endgame technique. And this is now in Kramnik's comfort zone. We see the position is quite even, 4 versus 4, bishop of opposite colors and the rooks. But white is still slightly better with the advanced e-pawn, and it's well protected. Black's the one now with double pawns. As mentioned earlier with the structure, how it changed from earlier on with the bishop capturing on f3 and g takes, and white has managed to undouble the pawns, and things turned out well for white, one can argue. Now black is the one that is on the back foot and having to defend this doubled pawn. Will he be able to? Let's see. e6. Now white applying serious pressure on the weakened f7 pawn. If white doesn't take this pawn and perhaps plays, let's say, a move like a5, which would be a mistake, just capturing the pawn, and black wouldn't be allowed to capture back as the rook would be pinned. And then king to g7, and white would be up a pawn, and we could expect ideas such as perhaps even rook to e6 coming into a6. So that would be quite dangerous. Or not rook to e6, because then the rook would be able to capture. But it would the rook would have a lot of open space to maneuver. So f takes e6, rook takes e6. Now white is aiming for a discover check on black's king here, and Kasparov, fearing that, goes king g7. Though it was suggested that a5 be played as well, a5, and after a5 we have rook to a6 with check, and then king to g7, and the rook captures on a5. Although yes, black would lose this pawn, he would have time to perhaps go bishop to c7, attacking the rook on a5, and with whatever white would reply with, rook to b8 maybe even, and applying some sort of pressure on the b file, with maybe ideas of f3 even. But f3 would be slightly premature, as the black dark squared bishop is still defending that. But the way Kasparov approached this situation with the king g7 move, natural response, but now Kramnik just captures on a6. Rook to f5, attacking the bishop on d5. And I want you guys to realize that this bishop has been planted on d5 for quite some time now, 10 to 15 moves that it hasn't moved, establishing its dominance on the a2 g8 diagonal. And it's only now that the bishop would make a shift to e4, having done its job thoroughly. And now we have rook to e5, again applying pressure, but now the simple f3, it defends perfectly. The bishop is in harmony with the pawn, and the pawn with the bishop. Very strong combination with the bishop and the pawn in this position. If ever in endgames you have a bishop and pawn endgame and can get a setup like this with the pawn and the bishop coinciding and helping each other, hold on to that, because it's very solid, and this pawn will most likely not be captured unless an exchange of a rook for a bishop and a pawn occurs. So as the game progresses, rook to e7, a4, Kramnik now sensing that, listen, I can promote, I can make a queen now, got a pass pawn, and he does just that by pushing it with passion to the a4 square. And we have rook to a7, now Kasparov proposing a trade of rooks, and if it's bishops of opposite color, more often than not, it would end in a draw. But Kramnik, not wanting that, applies pressure first on the bishop on b8, and now Kasparov cannot capture immediately, as the bishop would fall, and then black would be lost. So Kramnik getting a tempo with that rook b6 move. Kasparov then just goes bishop to e5, and perhaps now aiming for the same idea of bishop e5, bishop d4 check, king to f1, and then a nice bishop to e3, also just holding the position down, clamping that bishop on e3 and protecting the pawn on f4. So we have rook to b4, just defending the pawn now on a4, because it is under attack. Now the bishop to d4 idea is not possible immediately, as the rook would just capture. So Kasparov first plays rook to d7, perhaps now preparing for that bishop d4, as it would also really give this bishop a valuable space on this g1 a7 diagonal, because this pawn is running, and to have this bishop on this diagonal for a possible defense would be ideal for black in this situation. So after that, king g2, just escaping the check by running into a check with rook to d2, king to h3, h5. Now this looks kind of dangerous. Perhaps one would think, wow, that Kramnik's king can't really move anywhere, but there's no mating threats, so everything is still fine, though aesthetically it looks different. Rook to b5, attacking the bishop now on e5, king to f6, just defending, a5, rook to a2, getting behind the pawn. It's good to get behind the pawn. Rook to b6 check, and now with the king's next move, the goal would be then to just push a6, right? And soon to follow would be a7, and then a8, and a8's already covered, showing you the power of this bishop, how powerful bishops are. That's one thing we can deduce and take from this game, is to show how strong bishops are once they have an adequate amount of space to operate. So thereafter, after the rook b6 move, Kasparov plays king e7, and king e7 is the move that blunders the game. Can you guys find the winning move for Kramnik in this position? Prior to this move, the game was slightly better for white still, but with perfect play, black could perhaps hold it off to a draw. For those of you that got that wonderful technique in the endgame, and the move is bishop to d5. Bishop to d5 not only attacks the rook on a2, but at the same time traps or pins the bishop to the king, in that black has no way of defending the move rook e6 check, as there's just not enough time. So, for instance, taking the pawn on a5 would be perhaps the best move now, but after pawn takes a5, rook e6 check, king to d7, rook takes on e5, and even if king d7, thinking that perhaps I could win back a piece, the simple capture on h5, and with the trade then, because the rook would be on a5 taking the bishop, the rook would just capture back, the king would take, and white would be up a pawn in the endgame, soon coming to g4, and this pawn would fall as well on f4, and the h pawn would run. And it was then in this position that Garry Kasparov resigned the game. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching, and if you have any suggestions on a video I could do next, I will take time and analyze and come back with my understanding of it. For now, do enjoy the rest of the Kramnik-Kasparov saga of their game, of the 2000 match. This was one of 2 games in which there was a decisive result. So I will do the next video where there was a decisive result. Then we can run through the games that they drew, because it was a close match in the end. But just sharing this video, showing the dominance of the bishops once they have open space, if that's a takeaway for the viewer to take home today. Establishing or showing how powerful bishops are when they can operate freely, and how important it is to have your rooks really attack in the enemy camp, going into the back ranks, doing the hard work, and exchanging the queens when you feel comfortable enough with the position. Yeah, so until next time guys, see you.